Hi, everyone. Why don't we get started? Thank you for joining us today. This is Ben Hohen. I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm joined today by my colleague Joe Rand, who's also a researcher here at the lab. Salma Amala, who's also a co-author of this work, will not be joining us today, unfortunately. So all of you probably know that you have joined the conference in muted mode. That's to just cut down on any background noise that occurs. We are recording this webinar, and so it's important to do that. So you can't talk to us directly, but you can talk to us via the chat window. So we encourage you to submit questions via the chat window at any time during the presentation. Joe will be monitoring that chat line during the presentation, and then we'll both turn to it after the presentation is over to answer questions. So feel free to submit them whenever you feel the need and the desire, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So today we're going to talk about some work that we have done to analyze solar deployment trends in commercial real estate. I'm going to step through, let's just make sure, get this working here. So first, some quick acknowledgments. We'd like to thank the U.S. DOE's Solar Energy Technologies Office for their support of this work. We couldn't have done it without them. We'd also like to thank all of the folks that are listed in that second paragraph that provided comments on the research or draft results as we went along. A special thanks to SMR Research, which supplied us with the data and also provided a number of pieces of information as we went along. Just having some odd audio things, okay. So with that, we can turn to this disclaimer, which I need to show you, and the copyright notice, which I also need to show you. And with that, I can turn to the overall agenda for today. I plan to just give you a quick overview of the project and then focus in on the data that we use for the project and how we assembled that as data. And then we'll be able to turn to results. Finally, we'll round out the discussion today with some concluding thoughts. I will point out that there is a landing page already created for this research. If you Google commercial PV property, you'll end up at the page shown there on the right in the screenshot. I will admit that we used to have the full report up, but in our preparations for this webinar, we discovered that there were a few typos in that report that can be pretty annoying, and so we are just going through it one more time. We'll probably have it posted early next week when we post the webinar that we're recording today. So in terms of an overview, the goal of this work is to describe commercial PV adopter trends as it relates to real estate. That's an important component. So we're going to highlight differences between PV and non-PV properties, hopefully to elucidate some opportunities where future deployment can occur, given where it has occurred to date. Now, there are a number of different unique features of this analysis. First is that we used a nationwide data set of commercial real estate properties that was supplied to us by SMR Research, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we get into the rest of the presentation. As well, the extensive coverage of the U.S. solar market is captured by Berkeley Lab's Tracking the Sun data set, from which we drew the addresses that we matched ultimately to SMR Research's data. As well, we'll talk about the need to do some manual sample infilling. That was to increase the sample size where we didn't get a perfect match between the Tracking the Sun data set addresses and those of SMR Research. The scope of the work covers only rooftop installations, so this is an important distinction. There are obviously other parts of the commercial market that you're familiar with. For example, the community-owned solar market is considered commercial. That's not what we are focusing on today. Obviously, as well, we're not focusing on residential properties nor utility-scale installations. So the focus, as we'll talk about repeatedly, is on these rooftop installations on commercial properties. We used data for solar installations that occurred through 2017. Those were the data that were available to us when we started this presentation, started this work. we do have data now that stretch through 2018, and as we continue to collect data for the Tracking the Sun series, we will be potentially able to update this work in the future. And finally, this work is focused on basic descriptive trends. There's lots of deep dives that are possible in this analysis, and we'll mention some of them today. But we didn't do that. We wanted to sort of set the level for where we are on a number of these different characteristics and start there and then build from there. So potentially a multivariate analysis will likely follow next year, given what you'll see today, which is primarily a set of bivariate analyses. So that's the quick overview of the project, and now I can focus in on the data. So I mentioned that we drew the solar data from the Tracking the Sun series. So what is that? This is an annual data collection effort that we've been doing at the lab now for over a decade. The goal of that is to look at historical price trends for the distributed photovoltaic energy system market, so the PV market. And those data come in from a variety of different sources around the country. They might come, for example, from utilities who would collect those data as part of the interconnection process. Or they might come in from state energy offices or their agents that collect data as part of an incentive provision process. Or finally, they might come from permit providers that would be processing permits for the purposes of electricity or building permits at the local level. All of those sources of data are ones we use to try to get any data we can for this annual effort to look at installed prices. And some of those data come to us with addresses attached. It's those records that we're most interested in and that we can use for this analysis because we can match it using that same address to other data sets. Now, sometimes we are told what type of property those systems are installed on. It might say residential, it might say commercial, it might say higher education. It might have a lot of detail or it might have very little, and in many cases, actually, it's missing. But where we do know it, we excluded out the residential systems for this analysis. Sometimes it's missing, and we then came back to the data to understand whether it in fact was residential or not through what I'll describe in a moment here. And again, what we're focused on are those systems that were installed through 2017. So we take those addresses for systems that we have information on through Tracking the Sun, and we match them to two other data sets. The first is the SMR Research Commercial Property Data Set. This is the main goal of the work was to connect with this data set, and we'll be talking about these data as we go through this presentation. But we didn't get a perfect match where we thought we should. There were addresses that we knew were commercial but didn't match to SMR. Now that could be the case because the differences in having a mailing address that came in through Tracking the Sun versus the actual parcel address that SMR Research might have had. Regardless of the case, we wanted to include as many of those data that we knew were commercial systems that had rooftop installations in our project if we could. So we secondly matched those same addresses with the United States Postal Service through Melissa data. This returned to us an indication whether that address was either a business or a residential address. So where it was a business address, but it still didn't match to SMR, we wanted to include it. And we did. And we used a process to manually infill those data to match up with those data provided by SMR Research. Now the remainder, the group that didn't match, even though we thought it should, often constituted residential addresses that were marked as business or non-residential, or they were missing that declaration and yet were residential. The same is true with some utility scale systems, and in some cases just the address was wrong and we have no hope of matching it up. Ultimately, though, this left us with 32,000 commercial business addresses that we could use for this analysis. This covers roughly 60% of the same state commercial capacity in the state. So we did a pretty good job of having addresses for parcels across the various states that we looked at and we'll be talking about today, roughly 60% on average. Now, part of this analysis was to compare those PV addresses to those of non-PV properties, places where we haven't got a solar system installed already. And it's the contrast of those two types of properties that was the basis of this work. So we have to bring them in as well, and we'll talk about them on the next slide. So the goal here is to sort of compare those rooftop PV commercial properties with the full set of commercial properties that exist. To do so, we need to make sure there's a building that is existing on that property. And so we apply some data screens to make sure that's the case. The first data screen just makes sure that either building size is populated and or year built is populated and or the assessed improvement value is populated, all of which would indicate there's a building on that property. Those are ones we want to use. For the PV properties specifically, we excluded ground mount systems because they weren't the focus of this work, and they could have been on properties maybe that were not the focus of this research. As well, for the same reasons, we excluded systems that were quite large. These were systems that tended to not be installed on buildings, and so we made sure that they were out of the analysis too. Finally, we did a number of different screening of data at the top and the bottom ends of their distribution that we thought were potentially erroneous, and we turned them to missing, and the description of those cutoff points are shown there on the slide. So that allowed us to have this full set of data that's described in this table here. I don't expect you to look at the various levels of each individual state, but you can see that there are 20 states listed there. We have 32,000 commercial PV property addresses where we've got a rooftop installation, and we've got roughly 2.4 million non-solar addresses that we that we compare them to. The distribution of PV property addresses by state is shown in the pie chart on the left. We have roughly half of our data sitting in California. No surprise there. It's an enormous market. But we have a growing number, a fairly large number outside of California, included in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, and so on. These constitute 20 states, and 10 of those states are shown in this pie chart. The remaining 10 are in that last slice at about 3 o'clock. That is 6% of the overall sample. Now, there are some large states that ideally we could have and would have included in this analysis if we could. They don't supply us with addresses, or they don't supply us with any data at all. And those states are Arizona, Colorado, Maryland, and Nevada. Now, in terms of the temporal distribution of these installations, you can see that on the figure on the right. Roughly 75% of the installations occur from 2011 to 2017. In fact, 2016 and 2017 see the highest numbers of installations over time that we've seen in our study period. This is good news, potentially, and we'll get to those installations in a bit more detail as we get further on in the presentation. But I do want you to note that 2016 and 2017 constitute a pretty big number of the overall numbers of installations. This is important because at some points in this presentation, we do limit the data to just those 2 years. Finally, in terms of the fields used for the analysis, the property information is shown in the salmon-colored grid, and the solar system information is shown in the blue-colored grid. Now, the columns list the sources of the data. So where we have an SMR match, we obviously pulled data from SMR. So that would be the case for the SMR matching PV addresses and all of the non-PV addresses that were supplied by SMR. For those few addresses that did not match to SMR, but did match to the United States Postal Service, we had to infill those data. I mentioned that. So how did we do that? Well, we took the address and we put it into Google and Google Earth through a very painstaking process and determined through what sort of businesses use the property or are associated with that address, what kind of property type it would be. And that allowed us to infill those data. Similarly, we could look at the number of businesses that use that address as their business address and determine the number of occupants of the building. Really, this should be tenants, but we use occupants for a reason we'll explain in a moment. And we could determine the building size by using some measurement tools inside Google Earth. And obviously, we could look at the property and determine the number of stories. So that allowed us to infill some of those data. Now, we didn't do this for the entire 11,000. We just did it for 900 pieces of those data. And we did so with 40 cases per state at the very minimum. But this created the need to take that sample and transfer it back to the population. And so we did that through weighting. So, for example, if we found that 17% of the property types were education property types, then we would assume the full population was also 17% of that kind of property type. So where we have the USPS check mark for a property type, we're using that full set of data with those weights to describe the results in the coming slides. Where we don't have any check marks, for example, for owner-occupied, we restrict ourselves to just the SMR data for those slides. All right, so that gives you a pretty good feel for the data. One last point about PV penetrations. You'll hear me bring this up repeatedly throughout the presentation. I've been made to make sure you know that these are not roof penetrations. I know that's a big deal. These are PV penetrations, which means the number of PV-containing properties in an area as a percentage of all properties in that area that are of a similar kind. So a 5% PV penetration would equate to 50 properties amongst 1,000. It's important to know, though, in some states we didn't have data covering the entire state. I mentioned that some states some utilities provide us with data. Well, in those same states, we might not have data from the next or the other utilities. So we don't have full coverage over the state. So to deal with that, we limited the non-solar properties to only those in zip codes where we had a solar property. So this gave us relatively apples to apples and a little bit more trustworthy levels of PV penetration than otherwise would be the case. We recognize that this is a choice we made. There's some caveats in doing so, but we hope nonetheless this will be illustrative of differences across these various cohorts. So with that preamble, I can talk now about the results. So first we'll talk about overall PV penetration and then look at state and property type penetrations. The overall PV penetration in our sample is 1.3%. So those 31,000 PV addresses represent 1.3% of all of the addresses that are commercial properties with buildings in the zip codes where those installations occurred. And of course, that is the average across our full sample. We're going to see multiple different penetrations as we look through the various slides. For reference purposes, the residential PV penetration through 2017 was 2.1%. So they're in the same ballpark, but of course we see greater penetration of residential systems. Now, as we look across cohorts, and if we looked across different zip codes, we'd see higher penetrations. The first thing we'll do is we'll look at the state penetrations. Now, I just want to quickly describe this slide. Those penetrations I've been talking about are shown on the primary vertical axis to the left in blue and correspond to the points on the curve shown on the figure. On the secondary vertical axis on the right is the total number of commercial properties in that various cohort, which in this case is states listed on the x-axis. One last thing to note about the x-axis is it has passed next to some of the abbreviations for the state and DC an asterisk. Those represent areas where we had greater than the average coverage than we did across our full sample, which was 60%. In some of the figures going forward, we limit our sample to just those with greater than 60% coverage. So what do we see? We see higher penetration seen in states with longer histories of aggressive deployment policies. No surprise there. New Jersey and California have been at it for quite a long time encouraging commercial development, and we see higher penetrations for those states. The remainder of the states are at lower penetrations than that, and some might indicate significant barriers to adoption or fewer policy drivers. Clearly, though, in all cases, there's plenty of room to go. For example, in California, we have roughly 675,000 commercial properties that potentially could be developed with solar, theoretically, and we have only 2.5% of them having been developed. So there's lots of room to grow this market. Turning now away from states but to property types, those are listed on the x-axis. So we have the main property types which we'll be focusing on throughout this presentation listed there. I will note that there is the fourth from the left is a category called Other. That is actually an aggregation of a number of different property types, which I'll describe in our next slide. But for the remainder of the presentation, we just leave them grouped together. Finally, on the right side, you'll see Unknown Commercial. These are properties that are not attributed to a particular property type, so we just leave them grouped in that category. Oh, and one last point. Housing represents not residential housing per se, but rather large multifamily housing. It could be all residential, but it's aggregated in a big structure. So an apartment building would be an example of that. But so too would hotels and motels. So with that description, I can start describing what we're seeing here. Well, clearly, education properties have much more penetration than others at 6.9%. It's effectively off the chart, and I had to create this special figure just to show it. There is something going on with education properties that makes a big difference in terms of deployment. We're not exactly sure why that is, because they can't take advantage of the federal tax credit often. But there might be strong policies to see them install solar and not necessarily worry about every last dollar to be returned in their investment. That's one of the possibilities. The other possibility is that schools have some of the largest roofs in our sample on average. So this might be a reason why greater deployment occurs there. And you'll see that as we talk more about the size of buildings and the size of roofs in future slides. Industrial properties and warehouses also have fairly large roofs, second and third respectively, and we see greater adoption there. And agricultural properties might have benefited from the USDA grants, which have driven development on those types of properties. We see relative difficulty in deployment looking across other property types, municipal, retail, and housing. So now to dig a bit further into other properties, those are listed here on the x-axis, and we can see relatively high penetrations for recreation properties, club lodge and charities, and medical. And medical means hospitals. What we mean by the recreation property includes golf courses, country clubs, and indoor and outdoor recreation facilities. They have relatively large roofs compared to some of the other categories here. Maybe that's one of the reasons why they enjoy a higher penetration, but also maybe recreation and the interaction potentially with outdoor spaces might lead those properties to seek development of solar on them to align maybe with their overall business goals. Clubs and charities might have a concentrated ownership. They might not have tenants. We'll talk about these two things in a moment. And perhaps they have an environmental motivation, which encourages greater deployment there. Hospitals have relatively large roofs in our sample and often a single owner for the entire property. That might mean why they see higher penetrations. Parking facilities, which are off to the far right, have very low penetrations. And we wondered about this because we know there are opportunities for canopy installations on those properties, but there also is relatively low electricity use for a parking facility, and therefore maybe less of an interest in trying to offset that through what might be a complicated installation. Finally, I'll note that the mixed-use properties are the largest category and see roughly average installation percentages there. Those have a complicated aspect to them because they are, in fact, mixed use. They have multiple tenants using the property in different ways, and we'll talk about how those multiple tenants can create issues on the next slide. Oh, no, not on the next slide. Coming up. So what property and building characteristics are correlated with higher penetrations. One of the big ones is whether that building is owned and occupied by the owner. We see much higher penetrations of owner-occupied buildings than we do of non-owner-occupied buildings of the same property type. Those two categories are shown on the x-axis there, OO for owner-occupied or not OO for not owner-occupied. In all cases, across all property types, we see higher penetrations for the owner-occupied group. We should note that residential, that multifamily apartments and condos and hotels, are excluded from this because we didn't have good data on them for this purpose. So why are we seeing this? Well, one of the possibilities is this split incentive I mentioned previously, I sort of alluded to. This idea that the payee for the project and the beneficiary of its output might not be aligned. So in situations where we have an owner who's not on premises, that might be the payee for the project. And of course, if they're not on premises, they can't enjoy the energy savings. Others might be using the property and might be less inclined to endeavor into a long-term investment. Moving on to now another aspect, which is the number of occupants. These are data that determine the number of business addresses that are associated with the property. These might include tenants, and as well it might include the building owner. But as we can see, there is a trend between the properties that have fewer number of occupants and those that have larger number of occupants, with those that have larger seeing lower penetrations on average. We should note that the data, as we get out to larger and larger number of occupants, get a bit spotty, which is why we see that line jumping around a little bit. But clearly there's a trend here. And in fact, when we limit the data to just those properties that have high number of occupants, the highest in our data, which are office and industrial properties, we see the same trend. We don't show that on this figure, but you can know that's the case. For properties with multiple stories, we see lower penetrations. This is an issue that had been alluded to us by one of our reviewers, that as you increase the number of stories, the development of that property with solar becomes more and more complicated. You can imagine that. You can't just crane up solar panels as easily if you're on a 4 or 5 or 6 story building than you are on a 1 story building. Not surprisingly, we see cost per watt for installing these systems slightly higher than for buildings that are lower in elevation or numbers of stories. So this might be a driver for decreased penetration for those. Potentially also, we wondered if taller buildings are in fact around other taller buildings which produce more shade and might decrease output and a return on investment. Regardless, clearly we do see a relationship here between the penetration and the number of stories. Another interesting aspect is the penetrations as we look across larger and larger properties, the numbers of square feet as the metric there. We can see that it's relatively flat up to around 9,000 feet and then increases precipitously beyond that up to about 60,000 square feet. And we see some of the highest penetrations in the various cohorts we look at for those properties that are quite large in our sample. Now, roof size, which is only populated in a portion of our properties, would have been ideal for this figure too, because that's probably what we're talking about, not the property size. But we just don't have it for many properties. But for those that do have roof size, we see actually a very similar trend where it comes up to a certain point, actually 6,000 square feet, and then starts to increase dramatically beyond that. So obviously there's something going on with the size of the roof that incites greater deployment. No surprise there. We can see some economies of scale as we see growing sizes of roof. And that means lower prices, lower installed prices. No surprise when we look at that same issue, building square foot, but compare it across the various property types, we see a similar relationship. PV properties tend to be much larger in square feet than their cohort that is not PV. And this figure, I'll just describe briefly what you're looking at because you'll actually see these again and again. The diamonds shown here are the means for this particular group, and the space between the yellow and the green, the yellow and the blue here is the median. So the mean is the diamond and the median is between the two. So you can see in all cases the mean square foot is higher for PV buildings in the various categories, and in most cases the median are in fact higher as well. We also see a relationship between PV penetration and the market value for the property. As the property value increases, so too does the penetration. Those penetrations range from around 0.5% at $30 per square foot up to around 2% for properties at $225 per square foot. What's interesting, though, is we don't see the kind of drivers that we saw in some of the other metrics. For example, higher value buildings actually have smaller roofs than lower value buildings. And in fact, installation costs of these properties increase as the property value itself increases. So there must be something else that's driving this. And we had imagined maybe it's higher electricity rates for these properties that are of higher value, or potentially an interest in having the green cachet value for installing solar, which might meet sustainability goals and potentially be passed on to the occupants in the form of higher rents. It's unclear, but clearly there's a trend here. Similarly, as we break the same issue down, market value by property type, we can see a similar relationship as we saw with building size. PV properties are much higher value than non-PV properties across the board. We see that relationship whether we're looking at the means or the medians. Another trend that we saw in our data are decreased penetration as we see buildings, as buildings are older and older. Increased penetrations for younger buildings might be driven by lower prices, because we do see a relationship of the installed prices and building age. And in fact, that relationship gets even stronger as we look at buildings less than 45 years old, which means the slope is even greater between those two variables for just that cohort, the group that's even just very young, which means as you get closer and closer to the time that the building is actually built, you have more and more of an incentive, it appears, to install solar. Older buildings as well might have structural or roofing changes that are required as part of the installations that might not even be captured by our installed price, but could additionally add to the project's cost and therefore decrease the return on investment. So that gets through a number of property and building characteristics that are correlated with higher penetrations. But how have those characteristics changed over time in our sample? We now look at those. The first is the overall PV penetration. You've seen the figure that is depicted. You've seen the data that are depicted in the green bars depicted earlier, which are the number of PV properties installed per year. This shows you the trend line of the penetration over time as well. Now, what's curious is what happens in the 2016 and 2017 area, where we see an increase in penetration, an increase in number of installations, but not an apparent increase in penetration. The reason why that occurs is we have new buildings that are being built during the same period. So even though we see more solar properties being developed, we also have more buildings to which to compare them to, which is why the penetration is showing as linear. But clearly, we're moving up, and hopefully this penetration will continue to encourage and potentially go up even faster. Who knows? Well, when we look across the various property types, we see a similar increase in penetration comparing the period through 2012 to the period through 2017, the end of our data period. But there are no particular standouts here. Every one of the properties saw increased penetration, but no one saw a dramatic increase or a dramatic flattening out during that period. So there's nothing really to say here except that they all seem to be doing equally well, though at different levels from which they start. Where we look at states, though, we do see some important differences. Virtually every state saw an increase, but not every state. And in fact, some state, or in this case the District of Columbia, were major standouts. They are outperforming their peers. For example, D.C. enjoyed a 5x increase in penetration, and New Hampshire an 8x increase. Other states saw at least a doubling, except for New Jersey, which climbed from 1.4% to 2.3%. Now, I'm only focusing on those states where we had at least 60% data, which are shown with the asterisks. The others, we don't see that being the case, but we aren't sure if that's a data issue on our part or, in fact, a decrease in penetration or a flattening, basically no increase in penetration from those states. How have the key metrics changed over time? I'll be showing that in this slide. They've been fairly flat, actually, with some exceptions. So in this case, we're showing the number of occupants. And just to remind you, the space between the yellow and the blue is the median, and these diamonds are the mean. So in this case, we see the median not changing in terms of numbers of occupants of the property, but we see the mean having signs of going up pretty dramatically in 2016 and 2017. This might mean that those particular properties are being unlocked in terms of development, and that's an interesting thing that we'll want to take a look at in the future. In terms of building size, we see a peak in 2012 and then a relative flattening over the last 4 years. Now, this was interesting to us because we had heard that development is now occurring in smaller and smaller buildings because financing for those buildings is now being unlocked through a number of different companies, but we just don't see it in our data. Market value as well remained relatively flat within a sort of range of $150 to $175 per square foot in terms of the mean. Nothing really to say here. And similarly for building age, we see no real dramatic trend either way, either up or down through the sample period. Similarly, owner-occupied buildings as a percent of all buildings remained in a relatively tight range, between 50 and 55%. We do see an uptick in 2017 beyond that, which might indicate that this particular group of properties is being developed more rapidly than others in the last year, and that might continue in 2018. It's unclear. Finally, the last section I'd like to talk about are how PV system characteristics have changed over time. So we all know that there has been a precipitous drop in the price of solar over time. You can see that within this particular data set as well. And in fact, I've added in a 2018 data point because I was able to get it, which shows a continuing of that drop to $3 a watt from what was 2017's $3.40 a watt. So this should be a sign that deployment is encouraged to occur. How that will play out is really unclear. As we look across states, we can see a wide distribution of prices, and in this case, we have limited the data to the 2016 to 2017 range, so that you're only looking at the most recent installations. In some cases, we didn't have data recently from some states, and so you'd be looking at an old price if that was the case. So these are just those that have occurred more recently, and in fact, in some states, we have very few cases. Less than 30 cases, those are the ones that do not have a dagger near them. Those that do have a dagger near their name on the x-axis are ones where we have more than 30 cases, and in some cases a lot more. But we can see a price trend that moves from roughly a little bit north of 4 to a little below 3 across the states. When we look across the housing types, we can see Also a fairly wide distribution. The mean values are a little below 4 for some properties and just about 3 for others. Those properties with higher prices actually correspond to properties that in general have smaller square feet, and conversely, those that have relatively low prices tend to have slightly larger square feet and therefore probably larger roofs, which we know is an indicator of higher penetrations. This PV system size shows that trend over time. You can see it peaked in 2012 and then has effectively leveled out in the last 4 years. Now, this is, again, a sign that we weren't expecting. We thought we would see smaller and smaller system sizes over time. We might be in the future. We just are not seeing it now. One thing to note, though, is this does not account for PV system efficiency. So as the number of watts has remained relatively flat over time, the size of that system is actually smaller because the panels are more efficient. So in fact, this does mean development is occurring at smaller and smaller roofs over time. If we look at that same issue, PV system size, for just the most recent period across the property types, we can see that education, industrial, retail, and warehouse have some of the largest roofs. I think I mentioned that earlier. And agricultural, housing, and municipal and office have some of the smaller roofs. Some of the smaller system sizes, which obviously correlate with the roof size. In terms of third-party percentage, we can see that peaked in 2012 and then has been decreasing since then into 2017. Just a quick reminder here, we're not talking about community solar, which is obviously a high percentage of third-party owned systems. If we look at that TPO percentage across the property types, we see that education is at the top, and this is no surprise. Education properties would not have the benefit normally to absorb the tax incentive that is provided for the investment tax credit from the federal government, and so they are going to arrange the installation with a third party. Interestingly, you would expect the same from municipal properties. We don't see that here, and it might be because municipal properties are given a mandate to install the system regardless of the tax incentive. So, turning now to conclusions, and then we'll open up the Q&A here. If you do have questions, this is a good time to start entering them in the chat window. So this constitutes what we believe is the most comprehensive comparative analysis of this particular segment of the commercial market, the rooftop solar market on commercial properties. And this is important because this commercial market has enormous potential. Now, we haven't seen that potential being realized yet. We have relatively small penetrations overall. But we do see lots of signs of possible areas where that development could occur. One thing to point out, as is noted in the end of the second bullet here, is that during this period, virtual PPAs became one of the things that were much more available to these customers. And it could very well be the case that one of the reasons why we're seeing a lagging, let's say, or not dramatic growth in this particular market is because commercial property owners might take into account the fact that their transaction cost with signing up for a virtual PPA might be a lot lower than installing solar on their roof in general, and therefore might choose that over the installation on their roof. It's not totally clear, but that's one of our theories. We do see that 5 states, California, Mass, New Mexico, New Jersey, and Nevada, are seeing higher penetrations, while the majority see our penetrations closer to 1%. Though we do see some changes over time. D.C., the District of Columbia, and New Hampshire are both standout examples of that. We see the penetration varies significantly by property type, with education buildings having the highest penetration where housing and retail are some of the lowest. And there are multiple explanations for these disparities, including tax credit eligibility, roof space, sustainability goals, and maybe the ownership structure of the building itself. We saw that commercial PV properties declined significantly over the last decade, from roughly $9 to down to $3 per watt in 2018. This clearly is one of the drivers to higher installations and might continue to be so, though there are other things that seem to be correlated with higher PV penetrations that are independent or at least additive to cost. For example, building owners that occupy the building see higher penetrations, so too do buildings with fewer occupants and fewer stories, and larger properties and properties that are more valuable and are in fact newer also see higher penetrations. Despite what one would assume to be a heterogeneous market, we see many aspects of these buildings remain fairly constant over time, implying limited deployment innovation. And finally, the percentages of third-party owned PV systems over all states peaked in 2012 and has dropped since, just like it's dropped as well for the residential market. And tax-exempt entities do see higher percentages. So with that, I can wrap up the presentation. That brings us to the last slide here. These are our contact information, and we will be, as we said, presenting this recorded webinar online. And you will be able to find that at the landing page where you can just Google commercial PV property and find it. So, Joe, are you out there? Should we answer any questions?
Thanks, Ben. So we do have a few questions coming in, but I'll just remind everyone that we do welcome your questions via the chat window, and we'll dive right into answering those that we have so far. So to start, Ben, we had a question. Have you done any collaboration with Stanford's Deep Solar project? And the questioner notes that that project has had trouble separating residential from commercial PV properties.
No, we haven't. We have talked to them, actually. We are conducting maybe a parallel effort with Duke University to look at the possibility of extracting the locations of solar systems using satellite imagery. That's what the questioner is referring to. Sounds like an interesting collaboration. We obviously have data that we could use for this purpose. We do get those data through NDAs from many of our data providers, so we would have to work that out with Stanford. But we have made those overtures to them over time, and I'm not sure how much further they're going to take that project of Deep Solar, but we think it was a great effort, and it's really provided useful information about some of the trends in terms of income and that sort of thing in the marketplace. FYI, those data are not available at the property level. They obviously have them, but they do not offer that out. They only aggregate those data at the census tract level. So it's useful for that purpose to look at trends, but not looking at individual locations.
Great. So we have another question about the data, and that is, where can data like what you presented be found for other big solar states like Arizona and Colorado? Do data exist on the trends in pricing and system sizes for those states? And maybe you could touch on why they were absent from our analysis. Yeah,
so Arizona and Colorado are two states we'd love to get their data. Hawaii is another one. Those are states that have laws in place that don't allow them to share the data even with an NDA in place. We would love to have that not be the case, but that is in fact the law. In the case of New Jersey, for example, we can get the commercial properties, which we included in this analysis, but we're not allowed to get residential properties. And that law says that to do so, it would have to be that sharing the data could in fact improve the safety and security of the residents in the state. And we can't argue that that's the case with tracking the sun. And other states have similar issues. So we know these data are out there. They are, of course, being collected by the utilities. They know where most of those systems are, and potentially from incentive providers, but we just are not able to have them shared with us. So unfortunately, we don't have information on those. Though one of the questions we are asking ourselves is how different are these trends across states, and where we have large amounts of data, for example, Massachusetts and California and New Jersey. We might try to break down this analysis at the state level to see whether some of these relationships are different at the state level, and that might give us a better feel for whether it might be different in states like that you mentioned, the questioner mentioned.
Great, thanks. So I'm now going to try to combine two questions into one as they're very related, and that is, did you look at the correlation with the state's regulatory environment and or utility rates and energy and demand charges? And then the related question is, did we look at commercial power rates such as retail dollars per kilowatt hour or price per kilowatt hour and the presence and absence of net metering rules?
Yeah, these are all great questions, and this is exactly where we're going with the work next year. I mean, the utility rate is, of course, a big driver for whether you want to install solar or not. I mean, all else being equal, assuming the same building characteristics that we described today, you've got a lower rate versus a higher rate. You're going to install the solar at that higher rate location. There's greater incentive to do so because of the energy cost savings. So we know that's an enormous driver. We didn't have easy access to those utility rates at the address level when we started this analysis. And we know they're available. We use them for other projects in our lab, but we just didn't include it in this part of it. So it's a really good insight this questioner is having. We agree, and we will do our best to control for that. The other part of that question is that maybe is related is incentives that are in place at particular times. We know that incentives can be big drivers to installations, increasing or decreasing depending on whether they're present or not and their level, and those change over time. So as we look across time and we don't take into account incentives at the individual property location level, we're missing some key information. So we've thought about trying to pull in data potentially from the North Carolina Desire data set to capture some of that over time. We're still not sure the best way to do that, the most efficient way to do it, but it's a good question, and we want to do that.
Great, yeah, and actually there's another one that's sort of related as well, which is looking at the relationship with energy storage or DR, distributed resource demand response installations at these properties. So I guess, Ben, would you say that's kind of in a similar vein that might be something that could be analyzed in a future work that related to what you've done here?
Yeah, access to information about energy storage has not been, well, there hasn't been much storage happening over time if we go back in time, but we, of course, are seeing it now, and we know this is a big deal. We are just starting to collect data on storage from the data providers that have it and can give it to us and are willing to give it to us. So we could potentially look at the relationship of storage for these types of systems over time as we aggregate more and more of those data. We don't have too many data points in our data set. At this point, we just started collecting it for this particular year, so through 2018 installations, and as we get more and more of those, we hopefully will be able to do so. So those are all great questions. Thank you. And if I'm right, that tops off all of the questions.
That's right.
All right, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you guys joining us today to hear about this work. As I mentioned, we will be posting the full report, which has a lot more detail in it, online in a few days along with this recording, and hopefully we'll be able to report out additional work in this area as we go on in time. So thanks very much for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you. Please stand by.